Joining us this morning as our first speaker is Morgan Halsey, and she is the Director of Validation and Commissioning with Technical Safety Services. She supports and directs TSS, documentation quality, and report delivery systems, as well as the project management and special projects divisions. She has a Bachelor's of Science in Bioengineering from the University of California, Berkeley. And this morning, Morgan is going to be talking to us about the N95 Decon system at...
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Holly. I will go ahead and share my presentation. I'm glad to be speaking with everyone this morning. I appreciate the invitation to participate and talk a little bit about TSS in general and specifically our N95 disinfection solutions that we've been able to use successfully in the last few months. So before I get into specifics on the N95 disinfection system, I'll talk just briefly about TSS, who we are, what we do, and why we thought N95 disinfections would be a perfect fit for how we could support during this time. So we're a national provider of testing, certification, and environmental services. We support the healthcare industry, academia, private industry with testing and certification, and we're no stranger to the types of facilities and environments that really needed support for disinfectant solutions. So when we first were thinking about getting involved, taking into account the history of TSS and our nationwide presence, we really thought this was something that we could do to help. We're the largest testing and certification company in the U.S. We've been in business for over 50 years. Since the time that this presentation has been made, we actually even have more full-time employees than that. So we have a broad nationwide support system in order to offer this solution. With most of our support being our field service technicians, the team members that would actually go out, be in the field and execute disinfections. Not only do we have that presence, but those technicians and our organization as a whole has large-scale disinfection services as part of our routine service offerings. That combined with our ISO 9001, our ISO 17025, our accreditations, our certifications, we really thought we would have the process support in order to make this happen on a large scale. So specific to our disinfection services, this is very routine for us. We do small scale to large scale. On any given day, we probably have technicians out in the field at a client site performing a disinfection with either chlorine, formaldehyde, or vaporized hydrogen peroxide. Our large scale vaporized hydrogen peroxide process is completely validated. It's specific to TSS. It's made to be scalable. It's had decades of success at a 6-log reduction or more. And we felt that with the inherent nature of our disinfection process being that it was customizable, we built it to be able to go into any volume of space for any application and perform a disinfection, that when we started to hear about, the PPE shortages that unfortunately were happening, especially earlier this year when a lot of contingency plans were having to be made, we really felt that we could get involved, but we needed to answer some questions because disinfection of N95s on a large scale or routine basis, thankfully, had not yet been needed. So in order to go out and offer the service specifically for this, we had to consider, well, how do we do this safely? How do we make sure that, in handling of potentially contaminated respirators, not only with COVID-19, but with anything else that might be on those types of respirators from a healthcare type of environment, how would we go about this safely, not only for the personnel who would eventually receive a disinfected N95, but also for TSS personnel? How do we make this portable? Because we didn't want to be restricted to having a healthcare facility go through the process of, well, how do I get my PPE to the disinfection site? We wanted to be able to bring a solution to an organization and have the PPE remain on site. How do we make it high volume? There were a lot of solutions that were pretty immediately deployed for small volume disinfection, different sterilizers, equipment, UV, but for a high volume basis, if a healthcare facility has, tens of thousands of N95s, how was that going to work in that facility to make sure that they were supported and supporting all of their personnel? So we really wanted our solution to be high volume. And we needed to consider what inherently was part of an N95 as an item to be disinfected that would mean we would need to tailor our process to it. Like I mentioned, for decades we've been doing vaporized hydrogen peroxide disinfections, but no one had ever planned to perform this process on an N95. So we really needed to make sure not only were we going to be able to disinfect the N95s, but we're going to do it in a way that they retained all of the properties that we would want the mask to retain. So in order to go through that decision-making, we considered dosage, how much vaporized hydrogen peroxide we'd want to expose each N95 to, what was enough, what was too much, is there too much, how long should these respirators be exposed. With disinfection, it's not only about how much chemical or how much disinfection agent you use or just the property of the agent itself. It's also the duration in order to get enough lethality to be confident that you've actually disinfected whatever you're disinfecting. An effect on fit. So probably everyone here is familiar with the fact that it's not only the properties of the N95 that make it work, it's also how it fits to an individual user. So not only are we getting into a case where someone is going to have to reuse an N95, which never had been an acceptable practice before, it's an extreme situation. So now we have to consider, are we going to affect the fit of the mask on the reuse just by the nature of reusing it and also by exposing it to a disinfection agent? Is there any change in the efficiency? Does the mask itself lose any of its efficiency processes just from being exposed to vaporized hydrogen peroxide? How would we handle residue if there would be residue on each respirator? Would we potentially be redistributing a respirator to personnel with VHP still on the respirator? And then there's logistics. So I talked about we wanted to make it portable. We wanted to make it high volume. Well, how are we going to actually make that happen? How are we going to set up at any individual facility the solution of disinfection so that we could perform this high volume disinfection? And we really wanted to think about the end users. So if we're in this situation that's new to everyone, in the sense that we have to consider a contingency plan for PPE for reuse on a high volume, large scale nationwide, how are we going to communicate with users why disinfection between reuse is appropriate or what it does for their mask? All of these questions we've considered have been reviewed and give them this technical information to feel comfortable with receipt of a disinfected reused mask. So you might imagine that this took some time, but we did our very best to do it as quickly as possible, go through all of these steps and considerations in a way that we were very comfortable we were answering them correctly and without too much assumption. Thankfully, we did have some information to use from studies that the FDA, NIH, different universities performed to help us answer some of these questions for the effect on efficiency, the effect on fit. Is there residue after vaporized hydrogen peroxide exposure? So together with the previous studies performed and with validation cycles that TSS ran of our process, we were able to develop and meet all of these boxes. So a high volume solution, an on-site solution, and a solution that the FDA approved and gave TSS an emergency use authorization for. In that emergency use authorization, we presented all of the information from those studies, gave them our answers to how we would ensure users were informed on what a disinfection means for an N95, discuss the logistics of how would we collect the masks, how would we redistribute the masks, how would we know which mask had been disinfected versus not disinfected. So as part of that emergency use authorization, we worked closely with them to make sure there was nothing that we had neglected to consider, and they felt comfortable in our process as well. The end result of our method, we're able to define a solution that gives us a throughput of anywhere from 3,200 to 5,000 masks per cycle. And the reason for a discrepancy is just between the number of masks in each cycle is just related to there are many types of N95s. So depending on the size of that mask, we potentially can get less or more through in that cycle. There's also some considerations for the types of N95s besides just the size and how it affects the process, and that there are some N95s that we cannot disinfect just because of the nature of those masks and how the disinfection would work. Most specifically is any masks with cellulose. Cellulose is not a compatible material with the process, and any masks with a valve. So we're limited to non-cellulose, non-valve N95s. There's a lot of literature now, especially from manufacturers, about approved or appropriate models of N95s that can go through this disinfection. So at this point, we have a pretty specific defined list of models. 3M is has all of that publicly available on their website. We also have a list, and it's linked on our website. So besides the size, we also consider what the mask itself is. So talking a little bit more about the efficacy. So like I mentioned, we did have some great partnership with the FDA in going through what's an appropriate process and presenting why our process would be appropriate. We had Duke University put out a paper on their studies that they performed in April and March on a disinfection process for respirators. The FDA study was actually from, I want to say, 2016. There's more studies that are not specifically listed here through NIH, other universities, and really there were a lot of key parameters, but we focused in on the percentage of the solution, the ppm levels reached, and the duration that the masks are exposed to that ppm. We went full maximization of the effectiveness. So we wanted to be the most conservative, even if we could validate a shorter duration, or even if we could validate a lower ppm in order to get a 6-log reduction in bioburden. We wanted to just go ahead and use the longest duration, the highest ppm level, and make sure we were bringing that into our process, into our EUA, to make sure that we had all of our bases covered. So the end result was we would continue to use our 35% hydrogen peroxide that TSS routinely uses in all of our disinfections with VHP. We'd have to ensure that we hit 480 ppm or above per cycle. Our cycle actually hits much, much higher than this on a routine basis. We're most often around 950 to 1050, so it's pretty high. We've never had a process below the 480. And we have a minimum total exposure period of 30 minutes generation and 120 minutes well. So for a total of 150 minutes, there's VHP exposure on the respirators, with a minimum of 120 minutes of that being the maximum dosage of all VHP has been injected into the containment system. So to date, we've disinfected over 45,000 masks. Again, since this presentation has been completed, that's probably up by another 10,000. So we're sitting around 55,000 masks through multiple cycles of this process that we're talking about. In that disinfection, we've performed, I want to say, 9 different models of N95s. Are part of that number. So we've had a lot of success in field implementation of this process in order to get this high volume results that we've talked about. And all of this has been directly on site at healthcare facilities. Unfortunately, in the EUA, we are limited only to healthcare facilities. It's a conversation that we had with the FDA in could this process be offered on a broader scale? Could we remove the limitation of a healthcare facility from this process in order to offer it to anyone else in need of PPE without a supply chain to receive more new N95s? Unfortunately, right now we're still limited only to healthcare facilities, so all of the numbers we're talking about are specific to healthcare. In each of those cycles, to confirm the appropriate disinfection, we have chemical indicators, standard chemical indicators, qualified results of a color change of an indicator to make sure that VHP exposure for an extended period of time was had. But we also have real-time PPM monitoring to confirm some of these details that I have here of this minimum PPM. So for the duration of the cycle, through the generation, through the dwell, even through venting when we're getting back down to 0 ppm of VHP, we have calibrated PPM monitor for that cycle to view it in real time. This helps for more than just confirmation of the disinfection. We can also immediately tell if we're going to, it hasn't happened yet, but we could immediately tell if we're not going to hit that 480 ppm for that given cycle in order to take the necessary next steps. So I'll go next through just what this process is. So in order to answer all those questions and perform these disinfections, how are we actually making this happen? And it's a 7-phase process, although there's kind of more than 7 boxes here. So this just gives a life cycle of the disinfection, of the chain of control as well of these masks. Like I mentioned earlier, not only do we want to confirm the masks were going to be appropriately disinfected, we also wanted to make sure that we had control of knowing, has a mask been disinfected or not? Another key component of that question is how many times has a mask been disinfected? That gets into our decisions on dosage, duration, efficiency of the mask, and fit. We found that in the published literature at the time of our EUA, 20 was a maximum count. So in our EUA, we're able to disinfect an N95 up to 20 times. In actuality, you probably lose fit of that respirator at a cap of 5. So not only do we have the cap of the number of cycles in order to not lose efficiency, which is that 20, we also have a requirement of fit testing after each disinfection to make sure at that lower limit of the fit issues, we're not going to use a mask that has lost appropriate fit. So while the 20 is efficiency, the 5 is fit. So before masks are before any masks go through the disinfection process, we have the option to label them. We could also label them at the end, which is something we've done now with masks in order to confirm that we're handling them most often while they're clean. But if they have been previously disinfected, maybe through UV, sometimes in those cases we can label them upstream. But you're going to label, then you're going to use your first use of that respirator. We'll collect the respirators. This is in partnership with the healthcare facilities. The collection may be specific to returning the respirators to an individual group. It could be just large scale in order to redistribute them to users, but not necessarily return the same respirator to the same user. The collection is going to be specific to the healthcare facility and how they want to redistribute those respirators, but essentially we need to just collect them and get them to the disinfection site. They, at that point, are released to TSS. So everything in this red cycle here is not part of our chain of control. Until we receive the collected masks, until we know what's being released to us, that's part of where we partner with each healthcare facility. At the release point, we confirm how many masks are here, what type of masks are here, are they the appropriate type for this disinfection, have they been disinfected more than 20 times? We answer some of those questions at that release point. Also, between release and disinfect, we do verification of each mask for things like broken straps, any visible discoloration, any residue, anything with a visible defect does not go through a disinfection and we discard. The disinfection process happens on site in our high volume disinfection enclosure to meet those minimum parameters that we talked about. We'll confirm the results with chemical indicators, and some of you might really be thinking by now that I haven't mentioned biological indicators. Biological indicators are also run. These are required for the initial validation of each disinfection enclosure prior to shipment on site to any healthcare facility. We run at least 3 cycles without any respirators, confirm that that enclosure, that process, that ppm monitor, everything is working, along with 3 sets of biological indicators throughout the enclosure to confirm the 6-log reduction. We also then, the first 3 cycles with any respirators loaded on site for any disinfection enclosure include biological indicators. Thereafter, it'll be at least 1 cycle per week will include biological indicators, along with every cycle confirming with chemical indicators in our real-time ppm monitoring. So biological indicators are part of our validation process. We use G-Stero, standard VHP biological indicators to confirm a 6-log reduction. After the results are confirmed, if they are not already labeled, they would be labeled at this point. The labeling I'm talking about is actually a QR code system. So we needed to answer a few questions with our labeling. One, the end user, again, needed to be informed. They need to know, has this mask been disinfected or not? And they also need to know how many times has it been disinfected. So in our labeling system, each mask is given a unique ID and a QR code. And at the time a user receives a mask, if it has a QR code on it, they can scan that code, takes them to a website that shows how many times that mask has been disinfected, when was the last disinfection, and it'll also point them towards some of our informational materials that they can read and learn more about the process, who to contact if they have questions, how to perform their fit check, the information they need to know to be informed. We also use that system to track how many masks have we disinfected. Are any above 20? If they get to 20, they're immediately inactivated. That type of tracking is easier because we've built it into a software system with the QR code labels. Then from that point, when a user is able to reuse that mask, the entire process continues. Again, it'll go back through if it's any straps break, if there's discoloration, we'll check for that, and up to that limit of 20 times. After the confirmed results, that's, again, back to the healthcare facility in that label release process. So I'll get through a few key details on each of these phases. This is just an example of a form. Unfortunately, it shows an N95 with a valve on here. That's been revised to make it more clear valve respirators are not part of this process. But this is a requirement sheet that we give to each healthcare facility in order to communicate, make sure everybody's on the same page with the appropriate respirators that TSS can receive and disinfect in our process. Everyone who partners with us in that chain of control and releases masks to be disinfected to us provides us with a signed copy of this document. And we will also perform a secondary review of the masks physically themselves to confirm none are discolored or of an inappropriate type. We have a few other documents that aren't shown here, but that we distribute. They're all publicly available on our website that give more information about the disinfection process. So then, like I said, we're able to do this physical disinfection on site. We set up all of the equipment. We bring everything necessary with us. The disinfection enclosure is entirely self-contained. All we need is a place to put it with appropriate perimeter, and we're good to go. The appropriate perimeter and also the masks, of course. So this is just an example of a respirator that might go through a TSS disinfection process. The respirator itself is going to be given that unique ID not only do we give it the unique ID on the QR code label, we'll also physically write in Sharpie or some indelible ink on the cover of the mask the ID for that mask, just in case that QR code label falls off. That way we can have some reverse traceability, confirm the history of that mask, even if the labeling falls off. So we try to minimize how much we write physically on the mask. Sometimes, depending on the healthcare facility, they may also have an individual's name or initials or department code. Whatever is most appropriate to that process, we'll bring into the labeling. We'll also physically tag or label any that have gone to the mask that 20 times. So just by looking at the mask, you can see that it's gone through and not perform a disinfection past that point. We do communicate for safety as the disinfection is ongoing that we're performing a vaporized hydrogen peroxide disinfection. That's part of the perimeter that we need from a facility. We have requirements for safety of our personnel and any personnel in at the healthcare facility to not, of course, enter the disinfection enclosure or be in the immediate perimeter, just so TSS can maintain control of that disinfection process. We fully seal the unit, and we also have monitoring equipment throughout the perimeter in order to confirm any vapor that, should it leak from the environment, we would know immediately. We have audible alarms as well as long-term exposure monitors. We'll go through the physical VHP generation process. Integral to every disinfection enclosure is a recirculating fan system so that we can distribute the hydrogen peroxide throughout the entire enclosure and make sure that we're getting to every corner, every shelf, every single respirator. Through the dwell period, after the generation, the recirculation continues. And at the point where we've gone through the minimum requirement of the timing for both the generation and the dwell, we can, should we have received the ppm level that we needed, we can vent the enclosure, get back down to a safe ppm level, re-enter to confirm our chemical indicator results along with our ppm results, collect biological indicators to place on test. And from that point, we actually leave the respirators in that environment at 0 ppm for VHP for 300 minutes to confirm that no residue of any VHP vapor absorbed onto the masks would still be present at the time that an end user might receive that mask. We've had no issues with any respirators being found to have VHP residue even before the end of 300 minutes, but 300 minutes is, again, our conservative approach to ensure that we're not going to redistribute any masks with VHP residue. And again, we just go ahead and collect the masks, return them to the end users, make sure every mask is labeled and entered into the QR code system, and return it to the facility for reuse for up to 20 times. So thank you again for allowing me to talk to you a little bit about this topic. I've been really proud to be a part of the TSS team as we developed this process and have been able to implement it at healthcare facilities. It's just one small thing we can do to be helpful at this time. So if you have any questions, you're welcome to visit our website or reach out at any time.